This is my true story. I never thought the man who built this family would one day be silenced at his own table. My daughter told me, "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." I sat there with my fork in hand, my heart breaking and my dignity slipping away. I thought of every sacrifice I had made, every night I worked so she could have a better life. That night, I made a decision. But you won't believe what I did next. Before that, tell me where you're watching from. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people like me. From the very beginning of my life as a father, everything I did was for my daughter. I grew up with very little, and I swore my child would never know the hunger, the cold, and the smallness that I knew as a boy. When she was born, I promised myself that no matter how tired, no matter how broke, no matter how hopeless things seemed, I would provide. I worked every hour I could find. Days on construction sites, nights fixing broken machines in dark garages, weekends hauling bricks for men half my age just so there would be bread on the table and shoes on her feet. I never complained. Every ache in my back, every callus on my hands, every blistered foot was worth it because when I came home, she was there. My little girl. I still remember her first steps, the way she stumbled across the living room floor and fell into my arms. In that moment, I felt like the richest man alive. I had nothing in my wallet, but I had everything that mattered, and I told myself, as long as I breathe, she will never go without. When school came, I paid every fee on time. I never let her miss a trip, never let her sit at home embarrassed because we couldn't afford a uniform or a book. If I had to skip meals so she could eat lunch at school, I skipped them without a second thought. I remember sitting alone some nights, sipping only tea for dinner, while she slept with a full belly. I would smile, even with the hunger gnawing at me, because that was what fathers were meant to do. When she wanted to go to college, I didn't hesitate. I sold my old car, the one I had hoped to fix and drive into my retirement years. I took out loans in my name. I worked overtime until my hands shook with exhaustion. And when she walked across that stage in her gown, diploma in hand, I wept like a child. Not because I was tired, not because I was poor, but because I was proud that I had kept my promise. Then came her wedding. I watched her walk down the aisle, glowing like her mother had on our own wedding day. I had lost my wife years earlier, but in that moment, it felt like she was with me again, smiling at the family we had built. I paid for the reception. Every flower, every plate of food, every rented chair, it came from my savings. People told me I was foolish, that it wasn't my responsibility. But how could I not? She was my daughter. Her happiness was my duty. Even after she married, I kept giving. When she and her husband wanted a home, I helped with the loan. I co-signed the papers, put down the deposit, and made sure they never started their marriage in debt. Every corner of that house carried a piece of me. The paint on the walls, the garden in the yard, the porch light that kept them safe at night, all of it I had made possible. I thought to myself, this house will always be where I belong too. This table will always have a seat for me. And oh, the dinners. To me, family dinners were sacred. They weren't just meals. They were traditions, threads binding us together. When my wife was alive, she cooked on Sundays, and we'd gather around the table, laughing, arguing, telling stories until the candles burned low. After she passed, I tried to keep that alive. I wanted my daughter and her children to know that sitting at the table wasn't about food. It was about belonging. Every time she invited me for dinner, I put on my best shirt, polished my shoes, and brought a small gift for the grandchildren. A book, a puzzle, sometimes candy their mother said they didn't need. I didn't care. I wanted them to remember their grandfather with warmth, not distance. I wanted them to hear my stories, to know where they came from. I told them about the war years, about building houses with my bare hands, about their grandmother's laughter. I wanted them to see me not just as an old man in a chair, but as part of the foundation of their lives. Sitting at those tables, I felt like I still mattered. Like I wasn't just aging in a corner, waiting to be forgotten. I saw my family, my blood, gathered around me, and I thought, This is what all the years of sacrifice were for. This is why I worked until my bones ached. This is my legacy. That's why the insult cut so deep later. Because for me, those dinners weren't casual. They weren't about food or routine. They were holy. They were the last piece of true belonging I had left. I no longer had my wife. My friends had mostly passed. My body had grown frail. But when I sat at that table, telling a story to my grandchildren, I felt whole again. And I believed, foolishly perhaps, that my daughter understood that she valued it as much as I did. I never expected her to see my words as noise. I never thought my stories were a burden. I thought I was giving her children something that money could never buy. Memory, history, a connection to the people who came before them. I thought she saw me as the patriarch, the elder, the man who had given his life so she could have hers. But I was wrong. That night, when she told me to shut up, I realized the truth. To her, I wasn't the patriarch anymore. I wasn't the man who built her future. I wasn't even a father. I was just an old man taking up space at her table. It didn't happen all at once. If it had, maybe I would have noticed sooner. Maybe I would have braced myself for it. But the change came slowly, in little cuts that didn't bleed much at first. But together, they weakened me. My daughter, the same child I had carried on my shoulders, the same girl I had walked to school, the same young woman I had stood beside on her wedding day, began to treat me like my presence was something to endure rather than something to cherish. At first, it was just her tone. A sigh here, a small eye roll when I repeated a story. I thought nothing of it. I told myself, she's tired, she has children, she has a husband and bills. I should not take it personally. But then the small signs grew sharper. At dinners, when I started telling a memory about her mother, she would cut me off with a quick, "Dad, we've heard this already." The words were short, but they stung like a lash. My wife's memory was not a repeat story to me. It was all I had left of her. But I let it pass, forcing a smile, telling myself again, she's just stressed. The grandchildren, too, started to mimic her. Children notice everything, even the things you wish they didn't. When I began speaking, sometimes they'd glance at their mother first, as if waiting to see if my words were worth listening to. Other times, they'd giggle and roll their eyes the way she did. They were not being cruel. They were learning from her. Still, each time, I felt myself shrinking in my chair. The stories I had once believed were treasures began to feel like clutter in their ears. The pattern grew. If I asked a question about her day, her voice would sharpen. "Dad, I don't have time for this." If I suggested something about the children, a book, a way of doing homework, even a bedtime habit, she would snap back, "We know how to raise our kids, thank you." I sat there quietly, nodding, my lips pressed shut so I wouldn't let the ache inside spill out. I told myself she didn't mean it. I told myself she was tired. I told myself over and over that daughters love their fathers. But deep down, I began to feel a truth I didn't want to admit. The distance between us wasn't temporary. It was growing. Once, I remember we were sitting in the living room after dinner, and I began telling the grandchildren about how their grandmother used to sew their mother's clothes by hand when she was their age. I thought they'd like to know how strong and clever their grandmother was. Halfway through, my daughter stood up, clapped her hands, and said, "All right, kids, time for bed. Grandpa's boring stories can wait." She laughed lightly, maybe thinking it was a joke. But I saw the children look at me, smirking, and follow her upstairs without another word. I sat there alone on the couch, the words I hadn't yet finished hanging heavy in my throat. That night, I cried quietly in my car before driving home. Another time, I brought a photo album with me. I thought it would be a gift, something the children could look through, see where they came from, see their family history. I laid it on the table after dinner, excited to share it. My daughter glanced at it, sighed, and said, "Dad, we don't need old pictures lying around. Please don't clutter the house with this." She pushed the album aside, and I felt something in me fold in half. Those weren't just pictures. They were my life. They were her life. But to her, they were clutter. The worst was when her husband began to join in. In the beginning, he had always been polite to me, even kind. But as time went on, he followed her lead. When I spoke too long, I'd catch him smirking behind his glass, or exchanging a look with her that said without words, "Here he goes again." Once, when I struggled to remember the name of an old friend, he chuckled and muttered, "Losing it, huh?" They both laughed. I pretended not to hear. Still, I told myself to endure it. I remembered the nights I stayed up while she was sick as a child, holding her hand until her fever broke. I remembered the mornings I walked miles to work just so she could have bus fare to school. I remembered the way she used to hug me tight when I came home from work, my clothes soaked in sweat, whispering, "I missed you, Dad." How could I throw away all that love just because she had become sharp, impatient, cold? No, I told myself. This is just a season. Families go through seasons. She will soften again. She will remember. But as the months stretched on, the distance grew colder, harder, like winter setting in for good. I noticed she didn't call me unless she needed something. I noticed she didn't ask how I was feeling, even as my health began to show its age. I noticed that when I spoke at the table, the room grew heavier, not lighter. I wasn't a source of joy anymore. I was an obligation. I ignored it as long as I could. I smiled when they mocked me. I stayed quiet when they dismissed me. I told myself, she's stressed. She doesn't mean it. But the truth was creeping closer every day, waiting for the moment when I could no longer deny it. I wasn't her father anymore in her eyes. I was just an old man who had outlived his usefulness. And then came the night at the dinner table, the night she told me to shut up. That was when every small cut came together and bled all at once. That night was supposed to be ordinary, a simple family dinner, the kind of evening that used to warm my heart, the kind of ritual that made all the years of sacrifice worth it. The long dining table was set with dishes she had cooked. The grandchildren were seated in their usual places. And I, as always, sat near the end with my back straight, my hands folded, ready to be part of their world. To me, these gatherings were sacred. They were the heartbeat of what little family I still had. I came dressed in my best shirt, cleanly pressed. My shoes shined, because even at my age, I wanted to show respect. I wanted them to see that I was present not as a shadow, but as their father, their grandfather, the man who had laid the foundation for all of this. The food was passed around, plates filled, laughter bouncing here and there. I smiled quietly, letting the chatter wash over me, listening to the children talk about their school, their games, their friends. These were the moments I lived for, hearing their voices, feeling like I was still part of a family. When there was a lull in the conversation, I thought it would be the perfect time to share something that had been on my mind all day. It wasn't just any story. It was about my late wife, their grandmother. I wanted the children to hear about her, to know the woman whose love had carried me through the hardest years. I cleared my throat softly and began, "You know, when your grandmother was your age, she used to—" My voice was steady, calm, filled with the tenderness of memory. But before I could finish, I saw my daughter stiffen. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. And then, sharp as a knife cutting into the middle of the meal, she snapped, "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." The words hung in the air, heavy, brutal, final. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Surely my daughter, the child I had raised with love, the woman I had sacrificed everything for, couldn't have said that to me. Not here, not in front of her children, not with such venom. But there was no mistake. Her voice had been clear, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. Worse than her words was the sound that followed, her husband's laughter. He didn't rush to soften the blow. He didn't say, "Come on, that's too much." Instead, he chuckled, as if the humiliation of her father was something worth enjoying. That laughter made the silence around the table unbearable. The grandchildren looked down at their plates, avoiding my eyes. They didn't defend me, but I couldn't blame them. They were children. They were learning in that moment how to treat me, learning from the very woman I had once carried in my arms. The youngest fidgeted with his spoon, cheeks red with embarrassment. The oldest pretended to drink water, though his hands shook slightly. I saw it all, and I understood. They felt the weight of the insult too, but they didn't have the power to stop it. Inside, my heart cracked. I wanted to shout, to demand respect, to remind her of every night I had worked through pain, every coin I had saved, every dream I had given up so she could sit at this very table without worry. But my voice wouldn't rise. Instead, I lowered my eyes, set my fork gently on the plate, and kept my mouth shut. I let her have the last word, because I realized then it was not just a word. It was a truth she believed. The room moved on without me. Conversations picked back up, laughter returned, but I sat there like a ghost, invisible, humiliated. Each sound felt distant, as if I were no longer part of them, just an intruder at a table that used to be mine. My daughter had not only silenced me, she had stripped me of dignity in front of the very family I had built. That moment replayed in my head over and over as the meal dragged on. I thought of my wife, how she would have wept if she had seen her daughter speak to me that way. I thought of the years of love I had poured into raising her, only for her to repay me with contempt. And I thought of myself, sitting there quietly, swallowing the pain, pretending to be calm so the grandchildren wouldn't see me break. When the plates were cleared and the evening ended, I pushed back my chair slowly and excused myself. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was all right. No one even noticed the way my hand trembled as I gathered my coat. To them, it was just another dinner. To me, it was the night I realized I was no longer a father at that table. I was an inconvenience. And that realization, more than the insult itself, was what hollowed me out. It was the moment I understood that something had died between us, and it could never be brought back. The moment she said those words, the entire room shifted. My fork was frozen halfway, my hand trembling slightly, though I tried to hide it. The sound of her voice telling me to shut up didn't just echo once. It seemed to bounce against the walls, repeat in my head, and press down on my chest. I could feel the heat rise in my face, the sting in my ears, the weight in my throat as I swallowed down the lump that threatened to choke me. The worst part wasn't even her words. It was the silence that followed. A silence so sharp, it cut deeper than any insult. The grandchildren stared down at their plates as if their food had suddenly become the most fascinating thing in the world. Their little shoulders stiffened, their eyes darted anywhere but toward me. They weren't laughing, they weren't smiling, they weren't even breathing loudly. They were embarrassed for me, but also afraid. Afraid of what it meant to speak up against their mother. And that was what made my chest ache even more, because I had always imagined that my grandchildren would look at me with respect, with warmth, with admiration. Instead, in that moment, they looked at me with pity. And pity, I realized, can feel even colder than cruelty. Her husband's chuckle still rang in my ears. That sound, so casual, so unbothered, was like another slap across my face. It told me clearly that this wasn't a slip of anger. This wasn't something she'd regret later. No, it was entertainment. My humiliation was their shared amusement. For years, I had paid for their comfort, ensured their home was steady, and covered the gaps when life got too expensive. And yet, there he sat, smirking at my pain, enjoying the moment his wife reduced me to nothing. I lowered my head and said nothing. My instincts told me to speak, to defend myself, to remind them who I was and what I had given. But my pride wouldn't allow me to beg for dignity. If I had spoken then, my voice would have cracked, my anger would have spilled, and they would have dismissed it as the tantrum of an old man. No, I chose silence, not because I agreed with them, but because I refused to let them see me broken. My calm face was the last shield I had left. But inside, I was breaking. Memories flashed in my mind. I remembered carrying her on my shoulders when her legs were too tired to walk home from school. I remembered staying up through the night to finish double shifts so she could have a new dress for her school dance. I remembered her wedding, standing proudly as she walked into a life I had helped build. And now here I was, decades later, silenced at her table like a stranger who had overstayed his welcome. I tried to continue eating, but the food turned to ash in my mouth. Every bite was heavy, tasteless, suffocating. My hand shook slightly as I lifted my fork, but I forced myself to chew slowly, quietly, pretending nothing was wrong. Because that's what I had done for years. Pretend. Pretend I didn't notice the eye rolls, the dismissive tone, the whispered jokes behind my back. Pretend she still loved me in the same way I loved her. Pretend I was still the father she needed. But that night, there was no pretending. The insult had been too sharp, too public, too undeniable. I looked around the table one last time. My grandchildren silent and stiff. Her husband smirking into his glass. My daughter sitting tall, satisfied with herself, moving the conversation along as if nothing had happened. And me shrinking inside, my heart cracking quietly where no one could see. The humiliation wasn't just in the words. It was in the fact that no one defended me. No one said, "That's too much." No one even tried to change the subject to spare me. The silence was agreement. The silence was approval. The silence told me exactly where I stood in that family. Nowhere. I swallowed the last bite on my plate, placed my fork down gently, and folded my napkin neatly. My face showed nothing. Not pain, not anger, not even disappointment. Just calm. Because in that moment, I realized something important. If they could humiliate me so easily, then they had already stopped seeing me as family long ago. The meal ended, and people rose from the table. Chairs scraped against the floor, dishes clinked as they were gathered. Life moved on around me, but I felt frozen in place. My body sat in that chair, but my spirit was already gone. I knew then this was the last dinner I would ever attend in that house. Not because I was unwelcome, but because I would never allow myself to be humiliated like that again. I stood slowly, my movements calm, careful, controlled. I didn't slam my chair, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't demand an apology. I simply walked away quietly, holding my pride like a fragile piece of glass in my chest. To them, it may have looked like weakness. But I knew the truth. It was the beginning of something stronger. The beginning of the end of my silence. That night, as I drove home, the road was blurry through my tears. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, trying to hold myself together. The humiliation burned in my chest, but beneath it was something else. Resolve. A quiet, steady resolve that told me this was not the end of my story. This was the turning point. They thought they had silenced me. They thought they had reduced me to nothing. But what they didn't realize was that their laughter, their silence, their cruelty had given me something I hadn't had in years, the strength to finally walk away. That night, after the plates were cleared and the laughter of others had died away, I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I sat in my car in their driveway. The cold from the steering wheel seeped into my hands, and the quiet pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I didn't start the engine. I didn't turn on the radio. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the kitchen window where my daughter moved about inside, tidying up with her husband. From that distance, they looked like a family, warm, complete, content. And yet, I was not part of it. I was parked outside my own bloodline, like an outsider. I thought about her words over and over. "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." The sound replayed in my mind, like a cruel echo I couldn't switch off. For years, I had convinced myself the small jabs and dismissive remarks didn't matter. I told myself I was imagining things, that stress made her short-tempered, that deep down she still loved me. But those 4 words shattered every excuse I had built. If she could say that to me in front of her children, in front of her husband, in front of her whole family, Then she didn't just slip. She meant it. She believed it. She wanted me silent, invisible, erased. I sat there with my hands trembling on the wheel and let the memories come. I remembered the nights I had skipped meals so she could eat. I remembered the winters I worked double shifts in freezing conditions so her feet would stay warm in new boots. I remembered the hospital bills I paid when she was sick, how I never once let her see the fear in my eyes because I wanted her to feel safe. I remembered staying up late helping her with homework, even when I could barely keep my eyes open. I remembered the tears of pride when I watched her graduate, the joy in my chest when I walked her down the aisle, the way I stood taller even though my back ached from years of labor. All those sacrifices, all those years, all those moments I thought built love and respect. They seemed to collapse in a single sentence. I thought of her mother, my late wife. I could almost hear her voice in my head, soft but firm, the way she used to defend me whenever anyone tried to dismiss me. If she had been alive, she would never have let our daughter speak to me that way. She would have silenced the insult before it left her lips. I missed her more in that moment than I had in years. Sitting alone in the dark, I wished I could turn to her and ask, "What did I do wrong? Where did we lose her?" But there was only silence. For nearly an hour, I sat there reflecting, not just on the insult, but on my place in their lives. I realized something that night, something that cut deeper than the humiliation. I realized I was no longer a father in her eyes. I was no longer the man who had provided, who had carried, who had built her life piece by piece. To her, I was an inconvenience, a story on repeat, a chair that took up space at the table. I was not family anymore. I was a guest she tolerated until I spoke too much. And that truth broke something in me that could never be repaired. Tears burned my eyes, though I tried to blink them away. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, whispering prayers into the silence. I asked for strength, for clarity, for the courage to do what I knew now had to be done. Because one thing became clear in that driveway: love does not mean allowing yourself to be humiliated. Sacrifice does not mean surrendering dignity. And silence, though it had protected me at the table, could no longer be my only answer. I thought about how much of my life I had given them. The money, the time, the sweat, the years, all poured into ensuring my daughter's happiness. And what had it brought me? A seat at a table where my words were unwelcome. A role in a family where my presence was mocked. A life where I had become invisible in the very home I helped build. As the night grew colder, I made a decision. Quietly, without anger, without shouting, without demanding an apology. I decided this would be the last insult I would ever endure. There would be no second chance, no hoping for change, no waiting for softer words that would never come. This was the line, and once I crossed it, there would be no going back. I finally started the engine, but I didn't drive home with the same weight I had felt before. I drove with a strange calm, as if my humiliation had given me clarity. My reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look like a broken old man anymore. It looked like someone who had finally seen the truth and who was ready to act. That night, as I parked in my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat for one last moment in silence. Not the silence of shame, but the silence of resolve. I whispered to myself, "Enough." And I knew then that the next time I saw my daughter, she would not be looking at the same man she thought she could silence. When I woke up the next morning, I still heard her voice in my head, sharp and cruel. "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." But this time, I didn't feel only the sting. I felt something else. Power. Not anger, not revenge, but a steady awareness that I was not as powerless as she thought. My daughter believed that years had stripped me of authority, that age had made me dependent, that I was just an old man clinging to memories. But the truth was written on paper, hidden in drawers, signed long ago. The truth was that many of the things she assumed were hers. The car she drove, the roof over her head, even the family fun that made their dinners possible, were still tied legally to my name. She had grown so used to treating me as though I had nothing left to offer, nothing left to say, that she forgot something important. I had never signed those things away. I had never surrendered the keys, not to the car, not to the house, not to the life I had built with sweat and blood. She mistook my silence for weakness, but silence is not the same as helplessness. Silence can be a weapon, sharper than words, if you know how to use it. I sat at the kitchen table in my small home, a stack of folders in front of me. Deeds, bank statements, titles, contracts. Each page was proof of the sacrifices I had made, proof of the things I had built, and proof that despite her arrogance, her comfort still rested on the foundation of my labor. I thought about how she looked at me at the table, dismissing me like a burden, and I almost laughed, not with joy, but with disbelief. She had no idea that the man she told to shut up still held the strings to her life. The car she drove, purchased in my name, insured through my account. The family home, that mortgage was co-signed by me, and the land it stood on was still tied to my signature. The fund she dipped into when bills got too heavy, my pension, my savings, stretched thinner and thinner because I had always said yes when she asked. She thought time had erased my hand in her life, but time had done nothing of the sort. My name was still written everywhere. I picked up my old car keys, the ones I had slipped into my pocket at the dinner table the night before. As I turned them over in my palm, I realized how much those keys meant. They weren't just for starting an engine. They symbolized ownership, control, authority. When I had stood and taken them at the table, it wasn't a meaningless gesture. It was the quiet reminder that I wasn't a guest in her life. I was the foundation she was standing on, and the truth was, I could walk away at any time. The car could be gone with a single call. The house could be sold with a signature. The fund could be redirected, drained, cut off. She thought she had silenced me forever at that table, but she had only awakened something I had kept buried for too long. The will to reclaim my dignity. I thought back to the man I used to be, the man my wife had fallen in love with. Strong, proud, unshakable. Somewhere along the way, I had let myself shrink. I had allowed my daughter's sharp words and dismissive looks to convince me I was nothing more than an old man at the end of his story. But as I stared at those papers, those signatures, those keys, I remembered the truth. I was still the patriarch. I was still the man who built this family. And my silence was not weakness. It was the strength of patience, waiting for the right moment to act. I didn't storm into her house to confront her. I didn't shout or demand respect. That would have been wasted breath. No, my answer would not come in words. My answer would come in the quiet movement of power. My answer would come in the realization that the things she thought belonged to her could be taken away without a raised voice, without a fight, without even a warning. As I placed the folders back into my desk drawer, I felt calm. My humiliation at the dinner table had lit a fire inside me, but it wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It was steady, focused, deliberate. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to beg her to see me as her father again. That part of our relationship was already dead. What I needed to do was reclaim myself, and I would do it with the same patience I had always lived with. The keys jingled softly in my hand, and I slipped them back into my pocket. They were mine, just like everything else she assumed was hers. And I realized then that when the time came, I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't even explain. I would simply act, quietly, firmly, finally. Because sometimes the sharpest revenge is not in noise, but in silence. And I was ready to let my silence speak louder than her insult ever could. The next evening, after a long day of silence in my small home, I knew the time had come. The humiliation from that dinner table had not faded. It had settled deep in my bones, steady and undeniable. I wasn't angry in the loud, explosive way. My anger had cooled into something sharper, something cleaner. It wasn't rage that guided me anymore. It was clarity. For the first time in years, I could see my life without illusions. My daughter didn't respect me. My son-in-law laughed at me. My grandchildren were learning to ignore me. I wasn't family at their table. I was furniture. And I decided I would not live the rest of my life as furniture in someone else's home. I sat alone at my dining table, a plain wooden one with scratches and stains from years gone by, and I laid out my options. I could confront her, tell her directly how deeply she had cut me. But what would that bring? More laughter, more dismissal, maybe even sharper cruelty. I could forgive her, bury the insult like I had buried so many before. But forgiveness without change is only surrender, and I had surrendered too many times already. Or I could make the decision that had been forming in me since I picked up my keys the night before. I could leave. Not temporarily, not as a dramatic gesture to scare her, but fully, completely, finally. The more I thought about it, the more peace I felt. Walking away wasn't cowardice. It was survival. It was dignity. I realized that I had been holding on to the hope that one day she would see me again as her father, as the man who gave her everything. But hope had blinded me. Each year, she had grown colder, more dismissive, more cruel, and each year I told myself it was temporary. But the truth was right there in her words. Nobody cares. That wasn't stress speaking. That wasn't a bad mood. That was her truth. And so, I made mine. I stood up from my chair, walked to the closet, and pulled out a small suitcase. Not the big one I used for long trips, but the small one, the kind you carry when you don't plan on coming back. Slowly, methodically, I began to pack. A few shirts, a pair of trousers, my warm coat, the picture of my wife I kept on my nightstand, and the folder of important papers I had reviewed the day before. I didn't take much. I didn't need much. For the first time in decades, I was packing for myself, not for a family trip, not for someone else's needs. Just me. As I folded my clothes, I thought about the life I was leaving behind. The house my daughter assumed would one day be hers, the fun she dipped into without gratitude, the car she thought she owned, all of it tied to me. All of it would remain mine until I decided otherwise. And I knew that when I left, I would begin the process of cutting her name out of everything. The will, the accounts, the deeds. My silence at that dinner table had been the last thing she would ever hear from me. My decision now would be louder than any words. I walked through the house one last time. The walls were bare, the rooms quiet, but this place had been mine. It had been filled with memories of my wife, echoes of laughter from better days, warmth that had slowly faded since her passing. I touched the frame of the doorway, where I had once measured my daughter's height with a pencil, each line a record of her growing years. My fingers lingered there, trembling slightly. For a moment, I felt a pang of grief, not for the house, not for the things, but for the love that had once lived here. The love that had died the moment she told me to shut up. With my suitcase by the door, I picked up my keys. This time, I didn't think of them as hers, or as anyone else's. They were mine, symbols of what I still controlled, of what she could never take from me. I slipped them into my pocket, straightened my back, and whispered to myself, "This is the last time. The last time I would eat at her table. The last time I would endure her contempt. The last time I would allow my life to be reduced to silence." I looked around the room once more, not with sadness, but with finality. Every picture, every piece of furniture, every memory here had been colored by disappointment. And I knew that carrying those things with me would only weigh me down. I didn't need them. All I needed was the decision I had already made. And so, without hesitation, I switched off the lights, locked the door behind me, and stepped into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the sky above wide and endless. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of freedom. Not the freedom of youth, but the freedom of a man who had finally let go of the weight that had been crushing him. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make a speech. My daughter wanted me silent, and so silent I would be. But on my terms. My silence would not be the silence of humiliation anymore. It would be the silence of departure, the silence of a door closing, the silence of a man reclaiming his dignity. That night, I drove away. No destination in mind, just away. Away from the insults, away from the cold eyes, away from the table where I no longer belonged. My decision was final, my path unshakable. I didn't look back, not once. Because sometimes the strongest words a man can speak are none at all. I drove through the night, the dark road stretching ahead like a path I had been waiting all my life to take. The suitcase sat on the seat beside me, my wife's photo resting on top, her smile steady even in the dim glow of the dashboard. The hum of the engine was the only sound, and it comforted me more than all the empty conversations I had endured at my daughter's table. For the first time in years, I felt no need to explain myself, no need to soften my presence, no need to shrink into silence. I was leaving, and I would not be coming back. By the time the sun rose, I was 2 towns away. I pulled into a small roadside hotel, the kind with peeling paint on the doors and a flickering neon sign out front. To anyone else, it might have looked cheap, but to me, it looked like freedom. I checked in with nothing more than my name, paid in cash, and carried my small suitcase up the creaking stairs. The room smelled faintly of dust, but it was mine, my space, my choice. I sat on the bed, looked out the window at the unfamiliar street below, and for the first time in decades, I felt a strange kind of peace. That morning, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. He had been with me for many years, through the sale of properties, the setting up of accounts, the management of my small nest egg. His voice was calm, steady, professional. When I told him I wanted to make immediate changes, he didn't question me. He simply said, "Tell me what you need." And I told him everything. I wanted my daughter's name removed from my will. I wanted her cut off from every account, every deed, every asset. I wanted the house she thought would one day be hers to be prepared for sale. I wanted my silence to turn into action, action that could not be undone. He asked if I was sure. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, "I am sure." In the days that followed, papers moved faster than words ever could. Signatures, transfers, authorizations. My lawyer worked discreetly, just as I requested. My daughter didn't know a thing. While she lived her days thinking her cruel words had silenced me, the truth was the opposite. My silence had begun to erase her place in my legacy. I didn't call her. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. There was nothing left to explain. At night, I sat by the window of that little hotel, staring out at the quiet street, and I thought about what I was doing. Was it harsh? Maybe. But was it just? Absolutely. She had taken my sacrifices for granted. She had humiliated me in front of her children, in front of her husband, in front of myself. She had told me I was nothing, and now I was showing her, not with words, not with anger, but with silence and signatures, that I was still everything. I imagined her surprise when the truth would finally reach her. The phone calls she would make, the panic in her voice, the disbelief when she realized I was gone, and that the safety net she had always relied on had vanished with me. I didn't savor it with joy. I wasn't a cruel man. But I knew it was necessary. Necessary to remind her that respect is not optional, that family is not a one-way road, that a father is not a servant to be dismissed. Each morning, I walked down to the corner cafe near the hotel, ordered a small breakfast, and sat alone with my thoughts. The people there didn't know me. To them, I was just another old man with a suitcase, sipping coffee and eating toast. But to me, that anonymity felt like a gift. I wasn't dad there. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't a story to be silenced. I was just me, and that was enough. After a week, the paperwork was done. My lawyer confirmed it. My daughter was removed from my estate, her name erased from every line where it had once appeared. The house was listed, the accounts secured, the assets protected. With each change, I felt lighter. The weight of humiliation was replaced with the strength of resolve. I had not raised my voice. I had not demanded an apology. I had simply disappeared, and in doing so, I had taken everything she thought was hers. One night, as I sat in that small hotel room, I took out the photo of my wife and placed it on the nightstand. I whispered to her, as if she could still hear me, "I did what you would have wanted. I didn't let her break me. I didn't let our sacrifices be mocked. I walked away with dignity." And in that moment, I felt her presence beside me, steady and proud. The disappearance was not just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, complete. I wasn't just gone from their dinner table. I was gone from their future. And the silence I left behind was louder than any argument I could have made. The silence didn't last long. Within days of my disappearance, the phone began to ring. First, it was once or twice a day. Then, as the news began to spread, the calls came endlessly. My daughter's number lit up the screen again and again, but I never answered. I didn't need to. The lawyer had already carried out my instructions, and by now she would be learning the truth, piece by piece. At first, her voice on the messages was sharp with annoyance. "Dad, where are you? This isn't funny. Call me back." Then, days later, the annoyance turned into unease. "Dad, the bank says my name isn't on the account anymore. Did you do something? We need to talk." And finally, desperation. "Please, Dad, don't do this. I didn't mean it that way. You can't just erase me from everything. I'm your daughter." Her voice cracked on that word. Daughter. But the irony wasn't lost on me. She remembered I was her father only when she wanted something. The house was the biggest shock for her. She had always assumed it would one day be hers. She decorated it as if it already belonged to her. She planned family events there as if she were the rightful owner. But the truth came quickly when the papers arrived. The property was listed for sale, and her claim was nothing more than a memory. She called me in a frenzy, shouting into the phone, "You can't sell my house." But it was never hers. It was mine, and I had simply decided to take back what she had forgotten to respect. Her husband called too, his voice less desperate and more angry. He accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of tearing the family apart. I listened to his messages, shaking my head. Betrayal? Cruelty? They had mocked me, silenced me, humiliated me. They had treated me like an old man who had nothing left to give. And yet, when I finally acted, I was the cruel one? Number. What I had done was not cruelty. It was justice, quiet, measured justice. The grandchildren never called. Perhaps they were too young to understand, or perhaps they were shielded from the truth. But I thought of them often. I hoped that one day, when they were older, they would look back and understand that silence has limits, that respect is not optional, that even the softest man can choose to walk away. My lawyer sent me updates. My daughter's panic turned to resignation once she realized there was no way back. The papers were signed, the sales were final, the accounts were sealed. She had no legal claim, no power to undo what had been done. My silence had spoken louder than her insult ever could. And me? I didn't gloat, I didn't celebrate. I simply breathed easier. The weight of waiting for her love, the ache of hoping for her respect, the pain of enduring humiliation, all of it lifted. I no longer waited for calls that never came. I no longer sat at a table where my words were unwanted. I no longer lived half a life in the shadow of disrespect. She had told me to shut up, and so I did. But my silence didn't mean defeat. It meant departure. It meant she would never hear my voice at her table again, nor see my name on her future. She had pushed me out of her world with her words, and I had closed the door behind me with my actions. In the end, the aftermath was simple. She lost everything she thought was hers, and I gained the one thing she could never give me: peace. Today, I sit in a place far from that dinner table. A quiet cabin near the mountains, surrounded by tall pines and the sound of rivers that never stop moving. The air here is crisp, clean, untouched by the bitterness I left behind. In the mornings, I wake to birdsong instead of sharp voices. I brew my coffee slowly, savoring the steam rising from the cup, and sit by the window as the sun spreads light across the peaks. There is no tension in the air, no weight in my chest, no fear of what cruel words might come next. There is only peace. At first, the silence felt strange. For so many years, I had lived in the noise of family, the chatter of grandchildren, the scolding voice of my daughter, the echo of laughter that wasn't meant for me. But this silence is different. It is not the silence of humiliation. It is the silence of dignity. Here, when I choose not to speak, it is because I am content, not because I am silenced. I eat my meals alone, yes, but I do so with pride, not shame. Every bite tastes like freedom. Every breath feels like reclamation. I've made a new rhythm for myself. In the mornings, I walk slowly along the dirt paths, cane in hand, nodding to neighbors who don't know my story and don't need to. To them, I'm just another old man who likes fresh air and long walks, and that's enough. In the afternoons, I read books I never had time for when I was working and sacrificing, stories that take me far from my own past. In the evenings, I sit by the fire, the photograph of my late wife on the mantel. I speak to her sometimes, softly, telling her what I've done, how I've survived, how I've chosen dignity over humiliation. And in those moments, I feel her near me, as though she approves. The money from the house sale keeps me comfortable. I don't need much, just enough to live without worry, to buy my medicine, to enjoy small comforts. The rest I've placed carefully, not for my daughter, not for the man who laughed at me, but for causes and people who will value it. For children in need, for families who know what respect means, for people who understand gratitude. My legacy will not go to blood that turned cold. It will go to hearts that stay warm. Sometimes I think about my daughter. I wonder if she ever sits at that same dinner table and remembers the night she told me to shut up. I wonder if she feels regret, or if she has buried the shame as deeply as she buried her respect. But then I remind myself, it no longer matters. Her choices are hers, and mine are mine. I am not waiting for her apology. I am not holding space for her return. My story with her ended the moment I walked out, and I feel no guilt for that, because love without respect is not love. Family without dignity is not family, and silence, when forced upon you, is humiliation, but silence chosen on your own terms is power. So here I stay, in my small cabin in the mountains, living quietly, living freely. I have no need for grand gestures, no hunger for revenge beyond what I have already done. My peace is enough. My dignity is intact. My heart, though scarred, is steady. My final thought is this: she told me to shut up. So I did. And in my silence, I took everything she thought was hers, and I gave myself back the life she tried to strip away.